bullshit.
My name is Lindsay. I'm a senior principal hydrogeologist with Associated Sciences. And a month and a half ago, I think Sue called me and wanted to know if I could do a talk up here on the geology and hydrogeology kind of Whatcom County. And I said, yeah, sure, that'll be great. Because I've got this presentation I've already made that talking about a groundwater, conceptual groundwater and evaluation of the county that we've been working on for over 2 years now. So I'm going to go through this presentation a little bit with you, and it does talk about the geology and hydrogeology, but really I want to try to give you guys an update on what the county has been doing in order to get a better handle on what the geology and hydrogeology is of the area around here and how it can be related to some of these water resources decisions. And when I use the term county, I want to make clear that I'm talking about not only Whatcom County, but the Whatcom PUD, numerous municipalities, numerous other water associations are really kind of all involved in this project. The project that I'm going to talk about here started in 2014. My technical team was included Associated Sciences, Papadopoulos Associates, which is a groundwater modeling firm, Silvertip Solutions, which does surface water modeling, and Hydrogeologic Services, which is another surface water engineer. Perfect. The overall project objective was the county realized they needed a tool to help them make water resources decisions, and so they wanted to develop a groundwater model for, in this case, we call it the LENS area, which is basically just short for the Linden, Everson, Nooksack, Sumas area. That ultimately has the ability to estimate potential temporal and spatial impacts, just fancy hydrogeology words for time and space, to surface water resources, from activities ranging from, say, large-scale use changes in land use. You came in and you going to log 40 acres and change land use in that area, or you're going to, instead of having individual wells in an area, you're going to bring in a water supply system from outside, pipe it in. And so they wanted to be able to see how that would affect the hydrogeology of the area, and also from the use of maybe an individual groundwater supply well, particularly in this case like irrigation wells and that things. We had an existing surface water model. Oops, sorry. Bill. An existing surface water model for the area that we wanted to kind of couple it with the groundwater model in a loose way, and that the surface water model, one of the outputs of that model is actually groundwater recharge, which is one of the inputs to our groundwater model. So we're working on that. Again, using that model to help them with their water management decisions and all those things. I've thrown this in there that ultimately, you know, we're under contract now to finish the numerical part of this. I think everybody needs to understand that numerical groundwater flow models, they're basically a mathematical representation of an extremely complex natural system. And so there are limits to the accuracy which a groundwater system can be simulated, and those limitations must be known and understood. And just to give you an example, there's been a lot of talk around the county about what's referred to as the Hearst Decision, which deals with individual domestic wells. And several people have asked me, "How is this model going to help me figure out what my individual well has an impact to a natural system?" And I told them no. Just out of clarification, I was on a conference call with Papadopoulos and Associates, my groundwater modelers, who are extremely high-end groundwater modelers, and I mentioned that, and they didn't stop laughing for about 5 minutes. The amount of water that's used for a small individual well, the consumptive impact is usually in the 100 gallons a day. It's so small that it's simply not something that a numerical model is going to be very good at accurately predicting what those impacts are. They're essentially lost in the background of the model. So for those things, now if you were saying, again, if you were going to talk about doing a management decision where you were taking a fairly large area and Whatcom QD was going to run a water line in there, and now you weren't going to put in individual wells in that area, then the model could be able to tell kind of what that impact would have on the water resources.
Mm-hmm. Could you clarify a little bit about models will show hydraulic continuity even if it may not occur in nature because of the structure of the model? In other words, you have to have a head. If you have equal head, nothing is impermeable.
There's nothing is impermeable. Yes, that's very true. We hydrogeologists, as Andy know, we deal with Darcys Law, which is one of the underlying principles of our science. And basically what it says is that if you have a media, let's just call it a silt lens, and you have a gravel lens on top and a gravel lens underneath it, and it's saturated all the way through, and you have a well down in the lower unit, and you pump it, you create a head differential across that silt lens, silt clay lens, which most people get fairly impermeable. It doesn't really allow water to go through it. Well, you can mathematically calculate that it does allow water to go through it. And if you take that clay lens and say, okay, what if it's even really tighter? We're going to say it's, has a really low permeability. It's still mathematically, it's going to calculate, some water transfer across that area. And you could say, okay, what if we put a sheet of steel in there rather than the clay lens? Okay, well, steel actually has a measurable permeability. It's extremely small, but it's a measurable permeability. This is just a mathematical equation. It will show some transfer across that. And so in a mathematical model that we're doing here does show that. And from Andy's point, I guess, is that maybe from a, I don't like to use the word practical, but from a realistic point of view, you're not really seeing realistic water transfer across that, but the model is going to show something. And this becomes important when you start to do in the overlay of the regulatory environment. When it comes to impacts to surface water, we're held to a one molecule impact. So we cannot impact the stream by one molecule. Therefore, a numerical model theoretically might say there's one molecule of impact. But the reality is it's almost similar to talking about the individual domestic wells. It's down lost in the background clutter of the model. There's so many other unknowns and things in a typical model that, you can't, even though the model will spit out a number that says it's 32.06744419, it's not all of those decimal places. It may not even be the 32, it might be around 30, plus or minus 5, depending on where you are in the model. That kind of get to where you're looking at there. This project started, like I said, back in 2014 with defining the scoping. I'll just kind of go through this really quickly. And then phase 2, which we just finished in the fall of last year, was a fairly big chunk where we went out and we pulled together all the geologic and hydrogeologic information that we could find for the area. And we tried to synthesize it down into what was good data, what was bad data, what was replicated data, all of these things, and get it organized in a manner so that it can be useful, putting the data into databases that can be manipulated, getting copies of all the technical documents and putting them in one spot. We also established a groundwater data collection network where we worked with the farmers who were great to work with. They allowed us in some places to put long-term monitoring data points into their wells. This gives us absolutely critical information, which I'll touch upon later. They also allowed us to do long-term pump tests in the wells. And Bill talked about that a little bit ago, about you might want to pump your irrigation well for 5, 6, 7 days in order to really figure out what it does. Hydrogeologists love that because we pump it for long periods of time. It allows us to calculate fairly accurately aquifer parameters also. What exactly is the permeability of that unit? And out of the goodness of their hearts, a number of farmers allowed us to do that. We used their own equipment and we did it in the off season. We pumped wells. I think we pumped one for 14 days at one time. And so we got some great data from that. We did develop some additional surface water data and groundwater data. But probably the more important thing was we defined the hydrogeologic framework for the area. And this is important in that, you know, it's a big area, and I'll show you the model domain. It's, let me tell you, it kept me up at night many, many days. So I just wake up and thinking how large of an area I said I would deal with. But in order to put a groundwater model into it, as I mentioned before, natural systems are incredibly complex. We can't model all those complexities. So we have to dumb it down to a certain extent. And we have to develop what we refer to as a hydrogeologic framework that's relatively consistent across that area, that then the modelers can go in and do their thing. So we completed that in September 2016. We're moving on. Well, at the same time, actually, there was a phase 3 that went on, and phase 3 was funded a great deal by the Bertrand Watershed Improvement District. Henry's here, Henry back there, and Vern too. But that money that they gave to us on that allowed us to look closer at the Bertrand drainage basin and with the surface water model, make it a much more, I guess, data intensive model, which gave us a little bit more data accuracy for that. We're now moving on to the numerical model and design and development phase. I've been talking with the county people about this as scope and budgets and all that. I believe we're getting close to coming up with something that should be authorized here maybe in the next month or so. And we can move ahead. That process of developing that numerical model, which is now based on all that data that we did, is probably about 1.5 years long. And it's going to involve defining the model structure, basically calibrating it. You're going to calibrate it under steady state conditions. They're also going to do a simulated transient calibration of the model. And at that point, the model will be ready to be able to be used as a tool for the the water system managers out here to be able to try to get an idea on impacts to various land use changes and scenarios.
Sure. Is the model going to extend into Canada at all? Oh,
here we go. Yeah.
I knew everything.
Actually, I should have, in hindsight, I should put this model in there much earlier, this picture, but this gives you an idea of the area that I was foolish enough to say I would deal with. It's 426 square miles. This is the US-Canadian border. Here's the city of Linden right in here. Bellingham is down in this area. That's the Nooksack River flowing up and going this way. This is the Sumas River going that way. City of Blaine is up here, Sumas right there, to give you an idea. So it's a pretty big area. There's about 80 square miles are in Canada. Up into that area, there's 7 cities: Abbotsford, Blaine, Deming, Everson, Ferndale, Linden, Nooksack, and Sumas are all located in that area. It's fairly diverse geologically, but you'll notice that we purposely tried to avoid getting into where we knew there was lots of bedrock. So we lapped kind of up onto the bedrock, but we don't cover a lot of the bedrock areas. And that's not to say there aren't places within this model domain where there is bedrock either at the surface or very short distance down, because there is. There's 2 primary drainage mentioned: Nooksack River, Sumas. There's 38 secondary drainages, including places the Bertrand drainage, Fish Trap, Johnson, Sumas drainage up in here. So you can see all these different, 10 mile, 4 mile, a lot of things in there. There's also a number of different overlapping kind of areas that have been defined in the past. The lens area, again, that's that Linden, Everson, Nooksack, Sumas area, relates back to a 1999 work that was done by the USGS. Cox and Kale referred to it as the lens study, and it pretty much covered the area that's in yellow here. And that is, that's a very important document. It's very well done. As I mentioned, it was completed in 1999 when it was published. And it surprised me as to how much, when I was compiling all of the other data, and I would find this really nice document that was done in 2004, and oh great, here's some great data. And I start digging through it, and I find out that it's actually the lens data. They went back and they used the US data and put it into there. So So even though it looked like a really cool study and I thought it was going to have something in addition to, many of them were just basically reusing some of the old data, which was a great data set. There's a good reason for using it. We used it extensively in ours. The lower Nooksack subbasin is I believe the shaded in area here is what they refer to as the lower Nooksack subbasin. And then there was actually a numerical model that was done by Simon Fraser University that covered this purple area. And that was a fairly useful model for us to look at. It was not aimed at the same things that we were aimed at. They were really trying to set up a model up there, and their scenarios they were planning on running were more related to climate change, global warming, and those kind of things. But it was a very good model, and they were gracious enough to talk with us and give us a lot of information on that. Just give you an idea on some of the information that we did. 250 technical publications in database. My office for a year and a half, I couldn't walk to one wall because I had copies of all this stuff spread out on the floor. We summarized the data into databases. We also made PDF copies of every single technical presentation or technical document that we could get that's now in a searchable database. So you can not only look at the reference, but you actually pull the actual document up, which is nice. Number of things there that are going to be very, very helpful to people who come after us and continue to work on this. I mentioned before we did a groundwater data collection network, which is still in place and still working. Again, this required a lot of cooperation from various property owners who had wells that allowed us to put data loggers into their wells and collect data that looks somewhat like this. This is long-term water level information. See here, you can see it's going up and down seasonally. And you can see that some of these are in irrigation wells. And so this is the off season, and then you can see where the wells have been worked with, but you can still kind of figure out where your static water level is in there. Here's another one where the well was obviously coming off and on a lot. This long-term data is absolutely critical for the numerical model. And in that, one of the things the groundwater modelers want to do is they set their model up and they set it up on a monthly basis, and they run it, and they want to see the model itself predicts what the groundwater elevations are going to be in various aquifers in various places and through time. Well, if they have calibration points, if they've got a point over there where they've got 5-6 years of water level data, they can see how closely their model is matching that. And that allows them to get some degree of reliability that the model is working correctly. And if it's really off, they can go back and they start to reevaluate maybe some of the parameters, how they value the values they gave to some of their parameters in there. This data that we have now, it's unfortunate we hadn't started this like 10 years ago. We'd be way far ahead. We've got maybe a year, year and a half of this data. Modelers typically want 5-6 years in order to they want many different seasons to be able to see, to be able to calibrate it against. Again, I'm talking about the long-term aquifer tests that we did, anywhere from 25 to 200 hours. Gives us these nice, cool little diagrams that hydrogeologists love. We can calculate out those aquifer parameters, which are again critical for the model. Things like transmissivity, hydraulic conductivity, and storage. Those all relate to basically the parameters of the aquifer, how permeable it is, how much water can it produce, how fast does water transmit through it. All those things are incredibly important to us. Surface water data collection network. We pulled together all the surface water data collection that we could find. We also went out and collected surface water flows in numerous streams and ditches, which again is it gets us good information that helps us calibrate the models in certain areas. And then we did the hydrogeologic framework, which was certainly, from my point of view, one of the most challenging and difficult things to do, and took the most time. Believe it or not, geologists don't always call everything the same thing. The unit could be the same, but it might have 2 or 3 different names. And so we had a lot of different areas up here that have been covered by various authors in the past, ranging from the USGS to obviously very well known Dr. Easterbrook at Western and Bellingham. But they're general, the units, the geologic units were generally the same, but they tended to call them something different. So I had to sit down and try to figure out, okay, what they were calling them in the different places, and then come up with sort of a universal classification, and then meld all their maps together so that I had a superficial geologic map that didn't have different unit names and took care of some of these overlaps. And that actually took quite a bit of time. I basically took 87 overlapping geologic units and simplified them down to about 22 units for the superficial. And you could say maybe we lost some detail in there. The detail is still in there. It's just the names and the display on the model is a little bit easier to deal with. And what we came up with is we then took those geologic units, and this is all the way down into including bedrock, and we divided them up into what we call hydrogeologic units. And hydrogeologic units are typically, we refer to them as aquifers, which again are units that produce, I believe the definition dances around a lot and is certainly modified over the years, but essentially you look at it, it produces usable quantities of water. It's a formation that produces usable quantities of water. And the problem with that definition is somebody says, well, what's a usable quantity of water? I mean, how much? If somebody might say half a GPM is plenty for them and it's usable. Another person would say, I need 15. So it's a fairly vague term. But generally an aquifer is something that you're going to be able to put a well in and get some water out of it that you can put to use. And then you have confining units, or generally refer to them more as semi-confining units, because there's nothing that's completely confining. And they're much lower permeability units that while they have water in them, or may have water in them, it's very difficult to get a well in there and get much water out of them. So we divided these things up into these 7 units, one being the Sumas Aquifer, which I'm sure many of you have heard. We're sitting on top of the Sumas Aquifer right now. It's a very extensive unit. It probably covers 55–60% of the land area of our model domain, maybe more. It's a relatively thin unit in that it's maybe ranges from 120 or so feet to, obviously in some areas it's less than 10. Typically it's in the 40 to 60 range. Bill probably has a much better idea than I do on that, drilling around here. As he mentioned that he goes out and he drills and somebody wants him to go deeper and he says, I hit the clay. And that's what underlies that Sumas Aquifer is this unit here. We call the Everson-Vashon confining unit, which is that glacial marine drift is what the technical term is for it. A number of other units, but it's that clay material that's in the upland areas and things like that. It's a relatively low permeability. We have another aquifer in here. We called it the Sumas Everson Aquifer. This is a relatively localized unit that's kind of on top of some of the upland areas around here. It's kind of wave reworked material. It's been, a lot of the fines have been worked out of it, and it can locally produce some water. So it's not nearly extensive as the Sumas Aquifer, but it's definitely a very viable aquifer in some localized areas. And then as you go deeper, it gets a little bit more difficult to figure things out, but we have another unit aquifer below this clay unit, if we'll call that there, which is probably, by the way, this unit is 50 to 300 feet thick in some areas. I'm going to say something too, that we refer to this as a confining unit. So for our model, we're assuming that it doesn't really produce much water. There are plenty of wells that you can find that are completed within that unit that actually produce quite usable quantities of water for domestic use. It's generally a clay, but there can be a nice sand lens in there that people will tap into, and it's plenty for a localized use. But in a general sense, we refer to it as a confining unit. And we won't talk about the Deming sand right now. Andy and I have some discussions we have to have about that. But So you get this, below that clay unit, there's again, a unit down here, Vashon Olympia Aquifer. This is glacial material. It predates the glacier marine drift. It's usually coarse grain, sands, gravel, silts, clays, things like that. Again, generally you can find water in it. But again, same as a confining unit, there's plenty of places you can go down in this aquifer that you can't get water, that you just get unlucky. And that's when Bill says, drill deeper. Actually, that's what the hydrogeologist always says. Yeah, just keep drilling. But that's a fairly extensive aquifer throughout the county. It's, and I'll show you in cross sections, it's a tough one to get a handle on thickness, but my guess it might be 40 to 100 feet thick.
Yeah, this chart that you got here is horizontal layers each above the ones below them.
This is in general. Now when we get to the next slide, I've got a cross section. I can show you a little better how they lay out. But again, we've got then down below another kind of a lower permeability layer that again doesn't produce as much water. And then you've got what we find is a deeper aquifer down in some places that we refer to as possession Whidbey aquifer. Again, progressively as you go from age, it's also getting quite a bit older as you go deeper. And then at 7, that's the bedrock that underlies the area, and it forms a lot of the hills to the east and things like that. We refer to it as a confining unit. There's certainly plenty of places people put wells in and they get water, but generally it does not act as a very big interconnected regional aquifer. So this gives you an idea kind of the way they look, and this is truly hydro fantasy. So to give you an idea where this starts at, both of these start kind of in the Blaine area, both of these cross sections. So this would be up in the Blaine area. This one runs basically from the Blaine area down towards Ferndale. And so you can see starting in the upland area, there's some of this Sumas Everson aquifer. That was that wave rework thing that's on the upland that we talked about. It can be underlain by this unit 3 is that clay. Fairly extensive clay in this area. And then you've got another aquifer unit. This is that Vashon Olympia aquifer. And you can see I've got it kind of disappearing over here. I've got a well and we didn't hit it as near as I can tell. So it may be somewhat intermittent. And then we've got this other confining unit down here. And we've got that lower aquifer, that possession Whidbey aquifer. And you can see we got bedrock kind of sticking up here, kind of breaking that unit up in places. This is the same, starts in the same area, but this is again right up near the border, but this kind of goes parallel to the border to the east and kind of heads a little bit to the south. So we start up here again, you've got a little bit of that wave reworked. Here's your clay unit that generally stays up in here. And then you've got this aquifer down here below it that's, you can see it gets kind of thin in here. Not really sure. And so when Bill's drilling in this unit, this is your Sumas aquifer up here, and people say, well, I want you to drill deeper. Bill goes, cha-ching. We might have to go a ways before we hit something else that could produce water in there. And then if you really want to get a little scary, you start trying to aim for this deeper unit down in here. Now this deeper unit is interesting. This well actually is not too far from where we're sitting right here. City of Linden well. We drilled it down here for some exploration reasons, and we got down into this unit in here, and it's highly saline. It's got a lot of seawater in it, so it's not really usable for irrigation and or water supply purposes. And all kind of that well is over 700 feet deep. It's like 700-800 feet deep. It also has a static water level that's above ground surface. So that's a very pressurized system down there. It's under a lot of pressure. Now, you see how I've got the bedrock kind of going up here because I got a well that hit it here, and the bedrock kind of comes here. I've got a, but there's, bedrock surface, very irregular. You can have little knobs and stuff sticking up. We just recently, some additional exploration work we've been doing up in this area, we found that this bedrock actually goes up much higher than we thought and likely isolates a large portion of this area from this area, which actually has the ability to get water from this unit out of Canada, and then it flows into the Puget Sound. So the wells that are over here are completed in that unit are getting nice fresh water, very clean water. We go a short distance to the east and all of a sudden we got saline water. I mean, really saline water. And so we're finding out more and more about it. What this saline water is that 10,000 years ago, this was all under seawater. It was shortly after the glaciers had retreated, the land surface had been pushed way down, the glaciers retreated, the seawater came in, and as the glaciers retreated, they melted and they thinned and they floated. And so you had seawater sitting in here. And that's happened in the past many times, I think. But as those glaciers that were floating melted, they've actually formed that upper clay lens. That sandy, gravelly, silty unit that's down at depth, it got the saline water in it. Well, it has no way for the saline water after everything, kind of the land surface came up and you've got rainwater percolating through all these units. It doesn't have a way for the water, the seawater to get flushed out. So it's kind of trapped there. It's referred to as connate, old connate seawater. It's not attached to it's not seawater intrusion. It's just old leftover connate seawater. We have a nice term for it, but it doesn't help us here because we're trying to get something that we can use. But understanding where that exists is something that we're doing a lot more work on. Anybody have any questions on how this lays out? I know that it's not the world's greatest diagram for lay people to look at. That makes sense.
I've got just sort of linger one here. If you've got sort of an upper layer of water, why would you want to go deep?
You're talking about this, say up in this area. If you say you're in an area where maybe you can't get the yields that you want, there's enough variability in the aquifer that you're just simply not getting. Maybe you need 500 GPM and you can only get 50 and you don't want to put in 10 wells. Then you think, okay, well, maybe I can get better yield from this unit or maybe this unit if I want to drill that far down there. So that's one of the reasons. You know, another reason would be to try to get less hydraulic connection with surface water resources. If you were going to use a deeper aquifer, say you were going for water rights and you wanted to use an aquifer down here, one of the things ecology is going to require you to do is to figure out, okay, what's your impact on surface water resources? And once you figure that out, how are you going to mitigate it? Well, mitigating 35 gallons per minute of impact versus 350 gallons per minute of impact is easier. So so there's other things that kind of play into this when you're looking for wells.
That is potential contamination, surface activities.
Yes, that's true. We don't have a lot of that problem around here. I guess you could call the nitrate issues as being somewhat of things, but there is a lot, as everybody here probably knows, the Sumas Aquifer in the Linden area and around this has a lot of nitrates. It also has some EDB in some localized areas. That may be a reason for going deeper to try to get away from that. Any other questions on this?
Blaine has a grant to go down and dig some deep wells. Is that what you're talking about, going down into the
Right.
on the left?
Right. We're drilling a series of I'm working for the district and we've been putting in some deep wells in here. And our first one actually was kind of not right in this area, but generally in this area, we went through this stratigraphy and right about here, we hit bedrock. So again, higher than what we thought. We did not see, I don't think we hit this aquifer. I actually got some carbon-14 data back that says that it's Vashon age, the material right on top. There's some issues with that carbon-14 data, but
So was it salty?
it was a little bit saline. It wasn't bad. You know, it was right around the MCL, basically, the maximum contaminant level. So it would be possible to maybe use it, but the aquifer that we hit there was so thin. It was all of 20, 30, 40 feet thick and you got bedrock. So the ability to get a lot of water out of it was pretty limited. We moved to the west and went over here, and sure enough, we got down into the units down in this area, and it's much more water down there, a much higher producing well, and the water quality looks to be very good. So, and we're in the process of looking at drilling another well right now in that area. So, so we're finding out the more that we do with these exploration wells, the better handle we have on the extent of all of these units down in here, not only where they are, but how extensive they are. And that's really important if we're talking about trying to utilize that water for anything. It also gives us an idea of what kind of continuity do we have with surface water. And again, we have to be very, very careful about that because we're going to have to mitigate any kind of impacts we have to surface water. This is just an example of the database that we put stuff in. It's probably not that important for this audience, but basically we have a database that we took a lot of that information that Bill showed that was on a water well report, and we put it into large databases that we can then use and manipulate the information a little bit easier. We were able to use that information to create a lot of different maps. So I'll start with maybe this map, for instance. This is actually a map, a contour map of the top of the bedrock surface. And as you can see, it's a little hard to see on this because this was just to be kind of, you know, a display rather than really looking at it in detail. But this is a trough. You can see this trough. This is the Sumas Valley coming in here. So it's a fairly deep trough in the top of bedrock, and then here it starts to come up. So it's like a bathtub sitting in there. This is where we have that saline water. That saline water has been sitting in there for thousands of years, and it's really, it's probably getting some transfer of fresh water through it, but not enough to wash all that saline water out. Knowing the more we know about what the top of the bedrock surface looks like, the better we can kind of predict where we're going to see these things. This took a lot of effort to pull this map together. It's by no means absolute and perfect. There's very few wells that actually drill down and hit the top of bedrock. We have to use a lot of other less direct information to figure some of this stuff out. I'm actually quite happy and somewhat proud of this map. We pulled together a lot of data, and I think that this is probably one of the best representations that we have so far of that. We were also able to do right here. That's where it went. So what Bill say about big thumbs? So yeah, Linden's right here. Sumas is there. Blaine is right about here. Here's Ferndale. That deep well we drilled is right about there that I showed on the cross section. Again, we didn't hit bedrock with it, and even that well was 700-800 feet deep. We were able also, this is more of importance for the numerical model. We're able to come up with areas where showing how the parameters of certain aquifers vary, and that's what the modeler will use. This happens to be a hydraulic conductivity map for the Sumas aquifer, and it's showing that the permeability, if you will, is much higher in this area and then progressively gets less as you go maybe down in these areas. Most of the farmers here probably know that, hey, you know, if I'm in the shallow aquifer up here in Linden, I can usually get the water I want. As I move progressively towards Drayton Harbor, and that area gets tighter and tighter. It's much more fine-grained. The permeability goes down. We're able to show that. Transmissivity is just another hydrogeology term that relates to this. It's basically this times the thickness of the unit. So we were able to come up with that. And probably more interesting for most people is the groundwater contour maps, which show the elevation of the top of the water table, or for the deeper units, the potentiometric surface, and where that groundwater is flowing. And again, those are the kind of maps that we're generating with this, using the water level information that the farmers are allowing us to collect, and from other data sources that the numerical modeler will use to calibrate his model to. He will take this information and this information and this information into his model, and he will manipulate, because these are all ranges of values. The hydraulic conductivity is an interesting parameter. It can vary like 8 orders of magnitude very easily over a short distance. And so there's a lot of variability in here, but we've got bounds now where the modeler can say, okay, generally it's in this range. But that allows him then to go and manipulate his model a little bit and see if he can match these groundwater contours better. So it's one of the parameters that they'll be manipulating and moving around. I'm probably, if they were here, they would be screaming at me for using the word manipulating. I'm sure they've got a better word for it. But Bertrand Creek surface water model, I guess I mentioned this in phase 3. We actually divided Bertrand Creek up into, I think it was close to 50 different subbasins, and got much more detailed information out of that. So essentially out of the project, you know, if we go over our accomplishments, we reviewed, organized, and evaluated all the data. We've got a nice long-term water level monitoring network set up now that not only is in operation, but there's hopefully we can expand it to more wells in the future and collect data. And having been involved in this county for the last 25, 30 years, I just kicked myself for not pushing really hard 20 years ago to do this, to set it up, because that data is absolutely critical to have. We have a hydrogeologic framework that now we can use. Again, this is by no means perfect, and it's certainly inaccurate and probably incorrect in many areas. One of the things I want to skip back here and show you something. You noticed how flat that line is, and that line is, and that line is. And you also notice I don't have any wells down there. I just extrapolated stuff across here. I have no idea really what's going on in there. I have no wells down there. But for modeling purposes, and this is kind of on the fringes of the model, I needed to show something across there. So I speculate that there is probably some continuation of those units over there, but I don't really know for sure a lot about their attitudes, how they lay out. And you can see I don't have a lot of deep things. This looks like a lot. The reason it kind of looks like a lot is I chose to draw this cross-section line where I had data. There's plenty of places in the county I don't have enough data to even see into this stuff. So, but based on the depositional environments and what we know about the geologic history and stuff, it's probably reasonable to assume that there's some of these units are somewhat extensive. You know, what their parameters are, it gets a little bit more difficult to figure out. We've collected more surface water, groundwater data. We've set up all these databases now that are also living documents that as each new data point comes in, we're able to take that data point and log it into our technical databases. And kind of one of the critical things there is that in the past, we've always used Ecology's database, the water well report database, which is really nice. And it took a lot of effort from Ecology to get that together. But the water well reports that a well driller puts in there, they put for the location of the well is usually maybe a quarter section. Well, that's a pretty big area where it can be. And sometimes you can look at an address and you can narrow it down a little bit, but you don't know exactly where it is. The vast majority, we have 800 wells in that data set now, and the vast majority of them, we have Latin longitudes. We know where they are. And we've also ranked them on how well we know them. Some of them we know exactly where they are because I put my foot on them and I had a GPS unit. And others, we have a very good idea of where they are because, you know what, we got on Google Earth, which I love, and we saw the well. And you can see it, and then you get Latin Lodge. And so we have very similar ways, but we rank them all in degree of reliability. So finally now having not only the water well reports that the drillers develop, which is one of probably our best sources of information, but knowing exactly where they are is really helped out a lot. Developed a searchable literature database, again, that's going to be very important for people like Andy and myself, the two Andys here, because this is what we deal with all the time. We've got an improved resolution from a surface water modeling point of view in Bertrand Creek Basin, and we're moving on to this phase. And I think we're getting close. I threw up here. I'm sure everybody's aware of the Hearst decision. I think Andy Dunn might touch upon it a little bit in the future too, or in the next talk. But essentially, the courts under the Hearst decision, this has to do with what we refer to as permit exempt wells, individual single family wells, if you will. And the court held that the counties have the responsibility under GMA to make determinations of water availability for these wells. And they can't defer that responsibility to Ecology, which is what they've been doing in the past. And so they have to, anybody who wants to put in an individual well now for a permit exempt well, so 5,000 gallons or less, is they have to see is the water legally available there. And that involves looking at, okay, do you have an impairment to senior water rights? And if you do, and this is kind of an interesting thing. I mentioned before, you cannot have an impact to in-stream flows. or you have to quantify what that impact is. There's a difference between impact and impairment. In this case, we're held to the standard of impact for in-stream flows is 1 molecule. Impairment to a seasonal senior water right means you can't, the operation of your well cannot stop a senior water right from getting the water that they have a legal right to get. So you can't draw their water level down so much that they can't now get all the water that they were getting, assuming that their well fully penetrates the aquifer. Well, that's a much easier standard to deal with. And in the case of a single family domestic well, the amount of water you're pulling out in a single family domestic well is so small that your ability to impact a senior water right is pretty small. It's hardly, that's not really, I guess, a big concern. But this is a big concern because, again, 1 molecule doesn't take much to get to 1 molecule. So after kind of looking through things, there's probably a few areas in Whatcom County where in-stream flows are not a problematic or some sort of restriction to doing this. There may be some areas in the lower Dakota and California Creek. The regulations there for their in-stream flows indicate that the in-stream flows do not extend down to the tidally influenced section. And I believe there's there another stream in Whatcom County that has that same, well, I mean, the Nooksack. The Nooksack.
And I'll talk about that.
Okay, so Andy will get into that. Yeah, and also, I guess, and this is kind of interesting, but if you're in a coastal area, so you're in a place where you're only, you know, a short distance away from the seawater body, and you can show that the water that you're intercepting is essentially water that just discharges to the saltwater body, and there aren't any regulated streams nearby, you may be able to be exempt from the Hearst decision as far as the county goes. But Andy will deal with all that. If you do have an impact on surface water resources, you can start looking at some mitigation options, which would be imported water. There's been some talk about maybe expanding service areas, public water system service areas, to kind of pick up these areas. Interbasin transfers might be an option to kind of do things. Trucked water possibly, and again, I'm just throwing these out. I'm not going to get into some discussion really about how viable all of them are right now. You may be able to find existing water rights that you can change to cover your use, that you can legally change. I'll leave the timing issue. That's a Foster decision kind of thing. Rainwater collection, Department of Ecology has been telling us that rainwater collection is a viable option here for not only direct use as a drinking water source, but also you could use it as mitigation water. And the difference there, I guess, is that a typical single family home might use 500 gallons a day. But usually what happens is they use that water and 400 gallons of it goes back in the drain field, which then goes back in the ground. So only about 100 gallons, or 20% roughly, is actually consumed, which has the potential to impact, say, surface water resources. So if you're doing rainwater collection for direct use, you need to create a water storage tank to allow you to have enough water to provide around 500 gallons a day for long periods of time during the summer when there isn't a lot of rainwater, right? If you were doing it for just your mitigation water, it's possible you may be able to have a much smaller water tank, because now you're talking about mitigating 100 gallons a day.
Chuck, is that where we do in the summer when a lot of the water use is likely to be outdoor water use, which is mostly
This is I'm dealing with indoor water use only. That's absolutely correct.
Homes would not have any outdoor water use?
I'm assuming that if they were to go down this road and try to get a permit, that it would be restricted to indoor water use. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Outdoor water use, it gets much more difficult then at that point.
Before you change out off that slide, can you define an irrigation language? Can you define expanded service areas, innovation transfers, and timing issues? What do you mean?
Yeah, I'll let Andy jump into that. But as far as what I was saying, expanded service areas and interbasin transfers, I was more doing that aimed towards domestic use. And something, you know, say the city of Linden had additional water, which right now I know they're struggling with, but they knew that there was a part of the county that people could not put wells in anymore. And they had the water, and there was enough, managed to get enough money to run a water line out there. They could expand their service area out there to kind of take over that area. PUD could expand. Well, PUD serves area covers the whole county, so I guess that doesn't. But the PUD could run a line out to pick up some of these areas and do things like that. So I was aiming that more at, and some of those could be interbasin transfers. It could be water coming from the Nooksack River that goes all the way to Sumas. Technically, you could do something like that, interconnected. So they would be interbasin transfers, and those have their own little interesting twists to them about how that works out and stuff, and whether it's a positive or a negative. So that was kind of what I was getting at. You're talking about irrigation as far as being able to maybe move your water rights around and things like that for irrigation use. That Andy will jump in on that. It's fairly complicated now. Deeper groundwater use. Again, I mentioned that before. Maybe you're able to get to a deeper unit that has less continuity with surface water, and you're able to convince the Department of Ecology and over the county that it's less impact, then maybe you have less mitigation that you have to do. That's it.
Yeah, very broad question about gravity flow between a river or a stream and the aquifer below it, or the reverse of the aquifers in an elevated groundwater. Does it flow out naturally into the stream, the surface water?
Well, there's the general principle is that groundwater is going to flow from a high elevation to a low elevation, right? Unless you're in Vegas, and then groundwater flows towards money. That's how they got Vegas. But the thing is that's if you make that assumption under a natural system. So you've got typically in a basin, when you're up in the upper reaches in the basin, groundwater is tending to go down. So your hydraulic gradient is down. Okay. As you go through the basin and start to get closer to the base level, we call sea level, it starts to come up. Okay. So up here, you've got groundwater that's going out of the stream and going down to deeper units. And you put a well in up there and you increase that hydraulic gradient, maybe you're sucking more water out. Okay. Down here, where the water is coming up and it's providing water to the surface water, no matter how small, you put a well in there and you start to suck that water level down in there. Now it's not providing water anymore. You've reversed the gradient down. So it gets complicated to kind of figure it out. But yeah, as soon as you reverse that gradient, you can start pulling water away from something. Any other questions? Is it lunchtime?
Not yet.
Oh.
Actually, let's say it's